This is a speech that I've written about anti-Asian hate crime in the US. I've given you some vocabulary, but I'll just go through it quickly for the recording. So the China virus or Kung flu, the idea of a model minority, I explain what that is. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a piece of legislation, internment camps, Pearl Harbor, and Black Lives Matter. And I'll start my speech now. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think if I mention the idea of racism in the United States, you probably think of a lot of the suffering and violence suffered by African Americans, going back to slavery all the way up to the recent spates of police brutality. However, African Americans are not the only group to have suffered discrimination and violence in the United States, as we've seen in the recent rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. Before going any further, maybe I should define the term Asian American. It's a very broad term. It means anyone with Asian roots who also has US citizenship. And when we talk about Asian Americans, we tend to focus on people coming from 3 countries in Asia: Japan, China, and South Korea. Now, you may think that this recent spate of violence against Asian Americans is something completely new, that it's only linked to COVID-19. And yes, that is true to some degree. President Trump stoked up a lot of hatred against Asian Americans by describing COVID-19 as the China virus or indeed Kung flu. There has been an increase in violence against Asian Americans because of COVID-19, in particular against elderly people. And in fact, thousands of attacks have been documented against Asian Americans. Unlike his predecessor, President Biden has spoken out against these attacks and condemned them. However, violence against Asian Americans is nothing new in the United States. It's been going on for a long time, but people, the media, government have been turning a blind eye to it. Maybe we could look back at the development of this racism, how this racism came to be. Well, it goes all the way back to the 19th century, the late 19th century, when there were many Chinese migrants in the United States helping to build the railways. The United States government at the time started to get worried about all these Chinese migrants coming in, so they enacted a piece of legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this was the first piece of legislation which singled out a specific ethnic group or nationality. And the crux of this piece of legislation was that Chinese people living in the United States at that time couldn't become citizens, and no other Chinese people could move to the United States. And this piece of legislation, as I said, was enacted in 1882, but it was actually in place well into the 20th century for 60 years in total. And while the United States was excluding Chinese people, it was also welcoming many people from Europe, many white people from Europe. So there was a contradiction in the United States immigration policy. On the one hand, welcoming white Christians from Europe and excluding people from Asia. Throughout the 20th century, there were a number of episodes of anti-Asian discrimination. For example, in the 1930s, there was a series of attacks on Filipinos who were working on farms, for example, and they were attacked by white farmers for taking away white jobs. Of course, there were the shameful events in the 1940s, in 1942, when many Japanese Americans were imprisoned in internment camps. And this was, in effect, a type of revenge by the United States government against the Japanese government for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So there has been a lot of discrimination against Asian Americans, but on the other hand, Asian Americans have been held up as a model minority. So that means they're a minority that is successful, hardworking, a minority that keeps to themselves and don't create any problems. After 1965, there was a change in US immigration policy. It went from being an exclusionary system, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, to being more inclusive and based on merit. So this actually benefited many Asian Americans because they tended to be highly educated and they were able to move to the United States more easily. The United States government was also able to point to their Asian minority and say, look, this is a minority, they're coming from other countries and they're being successful, unlike the supposedly lazy Latinos or African Americans who were being sidelined and victimized. There was a turning point in the United States when it came to Asian Americans in 1982. At that point, a Chinese American was murdered in Michigan. And this murder was linked to the fact that Japanese car makers were doing better than American car makers. You'll know that Michigan is famous for car manufacturing. And this man was seen, this Chinese American man was seen as a symbol for the rise of Asian car makers. And as a result of this attack, new hate crime legislation was put into force. In hard times, the United States has often blamed its immigrants. It's very difficult for Asian Americans to speak up against this discrimination or violence. They fear being deported. Some of them lack the English language skills to be able to speak out. There's also the fact that many of them are coming from places in Asia where they would be punished severely for speaking out against the government. So the impression, the idea in many Asian American communities is just to work hard and to keep to yourself. And if you keep to yourself and keep to your own community, then everything will be okay. So it's created, in a sense, a very tight-knit but slightly disconnected Asian American community. Recently, some civil rights organizations have been set up for Asian Americans inspired by the African American movements. So, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement has forced Asian Americans to reconsider their role in the American society and to reconsider white supremacy. So what Asian Americans are seeing is that non-whites are considered to be inferior to everyone else. And this has really been an eye-opening experience. Asian Americans are sometimes in an awkward middle ground. They're not white, they're not black, they're somewhere in the middle. And they're sometimes used by white supremacist movements or President Trump. They're often pitted against other minority communities. The idea is that if you divide all the minority communities and tell them that they're only scarce resources, then it's a sort of divide and conquer system. Asian American racism is often much less overt than discrimination against, for example, African Americans. But I think what's clear in the future, if America wants to make progress and wants to better integrate all of its different communities, then the minority communities need to work together and need to resist these sort of divide and conquer tactics. Thank you very much.